Welcome back, Left Reckoners. I'm Matt Leck. With me, as always, David Griscom. Hello, David.
How's it going?
And joining us today, very excited, Charles B. Keeney. He's an assistant professor of history at Southern West Virginia Community and Technical College and the author of The Road to Blair Mountain, Saving a Mine Wars Battlefield from King Coal. Charles, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Matt.
Now, it's been a big month for you. It's centennial of the Battle of Blair Mountain. And I think the way to start, I kind of want to start it is, imagine we're at a bar and we both have full beers and it's halftime at like the West Virginia versus Maryland football game. I know nothing about Blair Mountain, but I heard people talking about it. What was the Battle of Blair Mountain?
Okay, the Battle of Blair Mountain was the largest armed uprising in America since the Civil War. And it is kind of the culmination of a series of violent episodes and labor struggles that took place in West Virginia roughly between 1912 and 1921, called the West Virginia Mine Wars. Now, you can go back a little bit earlier if you want to, or you can go a little bit later. But the main action was between 1912 and 1921. So you had this violent revolt that was basically a revolt against an industrialized police state that existed in the coal fields. You had a very unique situation in central Appalachia where coal companies built the towns and owned the land and owned every single aspect of the miners' lives. And they had what was known as the mine guard system, these private detectives that enforced their law. So miners were fighting back against this oppressive system. And what they did is miners that were on strike in one place called Mingo County were all living in tents. They'd been evicted from their company homes, and they'd been living in tents for over a year. The martial law had been declared after several violent incidents, such as the 3 days Battle of the Tug, which killed around 30 people. And state police had rounded up many of the miners and were holding them in pens. They'd slashed the tents, cut off the food supplies of the women and children, and they were all starving. On top of that, one chief of police, the only one in the whole region that stood up for the miners, was murdered on August the 1st, 1921. After that, the Union leadership in West Virginia organized an armed march that went from Charleston, roughly around Charleston, the state capital, with the intent of going to Mingo County, freeing the imprisoned miners, killing all the mine guards, and bringing food and supplies to the families that were starving. But in between, where they wanted to go was Blair Mountain and a series of ridge lines that almost makes kind of a natural fortress, the way the geography is laid out. And the sheriff of Logan County, who was in the pay of the coal operators were paying him around $130,000 a year in 1921, to enforce company rule. They assembled an army on these ridge lines with Tommy guns and machine guns. The miners' army and the coal company army clashed for 4 days, about 4 to 5 days, about 5 days. I think it wasn't much fighting on the 5th day, but a lot of surrendering. August 31st to September the 4th. And there you have it. The miners ultimately weren't able to break through because federal troops came in, and the miners surrendered to federal troops. So that's the basic rundown.
Yeah, and I mean, this sort of, this is a really incredible battle, just like from like a military history perspective too, just because of how well armed the folks occupying the mountain were versus the miners. But I mean, so there's this defeat, right? But it also really does spark a shift in West Virginia. Could you sort of talk a little bit about the aftermath of the Battle of Blair Mountain and what the legacy of it ended up being?
Yeah, well, the aftermath is complicated, to say the least. First off, there were about 50,000 Union coal miners in West Virginia. They had a very successful organizing drive during World War I. Mm-hmm. The first part of the mine wars went in the favor of the miners. The Pincree Cabin Creek strike happened under the leadership of my great-grandfather, Frank Keeney, who was a coal miner and who became a Union leader, then the Union president in the state. So they had organized about 50,000 plus coal miners in West Virginia, all except 3 counties. However, by the end of the decade, the 1920s, the UMWA was down to less than 1,000 coal miners that were Union miners by the end of that decade. That decade saw the highest rate of coal miner deaths in West Virginia history, over 400 deaths per year in non-union mines. Non-union mines in West Virginia history have a death rate 6 times higher than union mines. So when people talk about the Battle of Blair Mountain and the casualties are in some ways the thousands of miners that got killed underground in explosions and tunnel collapses and everything else because they were in non-union mines, because the union was wiped out for over a decade. That's one legacy. Mm-hmm. Second legacy is it kind of halted the union movement for a brief period of time. John L. Lewis, president of the United Mine Workers of America, felt threatened by the union leadership in West Virginia. And so he changed the union to where the UMWA president would only appoint district presidents as opposed to district presidents being elected. Frank Keeney, my great-grandfather, was the last district president to be elected for over 50 years until the Miners for Democracy movement got going in the 70s. And the two main leaders of that were Richard Trumka, was one big leader who became president of the AFL-CIO, and Cecil Roberts, who is the current president of the United Mine Workers. But you have that part of the legacy. The third part of the legacy, I don't know if you wanted an answer this long.
No, this is great.
No, go for it.
The third part of this legacy is that the miners didn't win the initial battle and they didn't control the narrative over the battle. Coal companies then worked to do several things. Number one, they worked with politicians to control state curriculum in schools, to wipe out the history and make sure that nobody knew what happened. And so that you only get a picture of coal as a benefactor to West Virginia in schools. This is continues to the present day. The mine wars are now in textbooks, but nonetheless, you have a group called the Friends of Coal that does a thing called Coal in the Classroom in the coal fields, and they do all these things with school curriculum. They have like mothers of coal that come in, and I don't know, it's insane, really. But anyway, it's a propaganda campaign that's endured for over a century in order to get people to think that coal is wonderful and great and a benefactor. And without coal, West Virginia would be nothing. It would be gone. It would be history. And that's really impacted people's worldviews in the coal fields. So they controlled the narrative, and the power structure remained the same. And you can't really understand Appalachia and that region of America today without going all the way back to this history. Like when people think of West Virginia now, they often think like Trump country. And you have to understand that in the context of this long period of the industry controlling politics and the narrative and the economy, and these battles being hidden from the general public.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I find so fascinating is, like you say, this mine guard system as it sort of worked through the ages, because you mentioned your personal history, but also talk about like the hushed tones that this sort of stuff was talked about, as you're growing up.
Yeah, a few reasons for this. Number one, of course, the miners themselves were sworn to silence regarding the Battle of Blair Mountain because they didn't want to indict the Union. After the battle, there was a series of treason trials which took place and lasted all the way to 1924. And what the coal industry wanted to do is they wanted to tie the United Mine Workers in and say that the United Mine Workers was guilty of treason so that they could destroy the whole organization and get it called like a communist insurgent agency.
Right, because this is in the context of, being super afraid of Russia.
Right. Red Scare had just gone through. The FBI is just getting off the ground here. And so, there's a whole lot of Red Scare stuff going on. Well, they want to destroy the UMWA. So the miners didn't talk about it so that they wouldn't implicate the leaders and implicate other individuals that might be, because a lot of miners fled the state. Since we created the Mine Wars Museum in 2015, families have come back to West Virginia from Indiana, Illinois, Kansas, Wyoming, because some miners just hopped on a train and went as far as the train would take them and started a new life there. And so descendants of those individuals have come to us in recent years because, they didn't want to be indicted for treason or murder or any of the various other crimes. So that you have that code of silence. Then in the context of the fact that the miners didn't come out on the winning side at first, it's not in textbooks. And it was also, of course, when I was a kid, growing up in the late 80s and early 90s, you still had the Cold War going on. And so a lot of the miners themselves were socialists, not all of them, but a lot of the leadership, they were all pretty much all socialists. And so socialism was a dirty word while the Cold War was still going on. You didn't have anybody talking. If you're old enough to remember that, I don't think y'all are, may not be old enough to remember the Cold War atmosphere, but any talk of socialism was just no. I mean, this is when Rocky Balboa was fighting Drago and, and in Rocky IV and stuff. So, I mean, that was just un-American. So no, people weren't proud of the history because of that.
Yeah. It's amazing to me. We talked about this a bit on Left Reckoning weeks ago that, we have this sort of cartoon version of the Hatfield Mccoy battle, but this battle where it was a massive battle where there's literally airplanes dropping bombs from the sky in 1921. And that's something we just sort of get memory hold.
Second time, that was the second time when U.S. citizens dropped bombs on other U.S. citizens. The first time that took place was about 90 days before that at Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
The Tulsa Massacre. And that I think both events have to be taken in context with one another, because you had a lot of black miners that had taken up arms, and they had to be thinking about what had just happened in Tulsa. There was a coal operator that we have the quote on the wall at the Mine Wars Museum that talks about a coal operator just saying that it was just complete terrorism everywhere, because everywhere you looked, you would see a collared man with a gun. And so for them, that was the ultimate thing in terror. Black people, immigrants, and poor white people all joining forces and picking up arms. That is the nightmare scenario of the ruling class, and it was happening in West Virginia.
Yeah, could you talk about that a little bit more in depth? Like, what was the makeup of the folks who really were, leading the charge of the Battle of Blair Mountain? Where did they come from? What kind of folks were they?
Okay, so we don't know the exact percentages of the people that were on the march and participated in the battle. But here's what we do know: we know that about 20% of the miners were black in West Virginia at the time. About 35% were immigrant, and about 45% were native white. That's a pretty big mix, considering the demographics of the time. There were, I believe, somewhere in the neighborhood of 28 different nationalities in West Virginia at that time of immigrant groups. And that's partly important because when people think of Appalachia, they only think of a racially homogenous region. But it was incredibly diverse, and these coal camps were incredibly diverse. And so you had a lot of black miners, and coal mining, by the way, was the only occupation, I believe the only occupation in America at that time where a black man made the same money as a white man. Wow. And because they were paid by the ton, they were not paid by the hour. And additionally, the United Mine Workers was the first major union to actively try to organize blacks. In fact, when they were founded in 1890, they had an anti-discrimination clause in their original constitution, and they were the only union to do that early on, because they knew that they would have to. You would have to organize blacks. You're going to have to organize immigrants, or you can't organize the coal fields. That you just can't, because there's a much larger mix. So it was this big amalgamation of different groups. And you had the first miner that was killed on Blair Mountain, Eli Kent, was a black miner. First guy killed in the battle. You had one guy, I believe his name was Popcorn Robertson. That was a nickname of sorts. He was a black man who led a group of about 75 men into battle, some of which were white. So not only did you have an integrated army, which they were integrated a generation before the U.S. Army was integrated, right, but you also had instances where black men were leading white men into battle. And that's an anomaly, to say the least, in American history at that time.
Yeah.
It's really fascinating. I mean, one, like Blair Mountain being one of those stories that is very much like, sort of hidden in a lot of people's like remembrance of like U.S. history. But all across the country, we find these kind of stories. We've had Megan Day on the show a few times to talk about, some really incredible discoveries of like socialist colleges in Arkansas, Green Corn Rebellion. Here in Texas, we have a pretty radical history too, but was a really successful movement, I feel like, across the South, and I would imagine across the rest of the country, like 50s plus, to completely make it seem like the entire history of these regions was just like, extremely conservative kind of right-wing politics. And we do have this rich history. But on top of that, and what I want to sort of ask you about is the history of Blair Mountain and the conditions that the working people were facing then is really interesting today, 100 years out, because obviously the conditions are different and the industries are different. But questions of building like cross-racial solidarity is obviously one that's very, very prevalent today on the left, along with the fact that Silicon Valley keeps on sort of re-innovating capitalism, where you're having companies like Facebook talking about paying their employees and script, essentially, right? We'll give you Facebook currency,
right.
Could you sort of paint a little bit of a picture of those things like script and company towns, just because I think it's really important for people to remember that history and why it was bad and harmful to workers, because you do see a lot of people in this kind of like digital capitalism, reinventing those systems today.
Yeah. And I say this a lot. Blair Mountain isn't about who we were, it's about who we are. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of situations like today, not just in the United States, but globally, that are very similar to what was going on. But let's talk a little bit about that, the mine guard system of the late 1800s and early 1900s. So scrip, you mentioned scrip, company money. Now, each company had its own money, okay, that they made. And we have all kinds at the Mine Wars Museum, have all kinds of examples of scrip from all kinds of different companies. They would only let you use the coins once. They weren't reusable. They would like put a hole in it once it was used once, and then they would restamp it. But so each company had their own script, their own version. So you couldn't go from one company store to another company store, right? And these little, these were only redeemable at the company stores. There were a few stores maybe outside in nearby towns that might take company script, but you could never get it what it was worth on an American dollar. So, and in some cases, you had company script that dictated what you could buy, like specific items. We have a piece of script that says good for one loaf of bread. And so imagine getting that on your payday, how enraged you would be, because it's dictating to you what you can buy.
Yeah.
And so when you begin to see things like that, you begin to see their anger swelling up. You have a situation where the death rate within the mines was incredible, in addition to the company script. You don't get American money. You have to pay your own equipment, pay for your own equipment, like your own dynamite, your own pick and shovel, your own canary cage. We have a little canary cage that was actually used. That's about 120 years old.
Oh, wow.
At the Mine Wars Museum. Everybody says
they were independent contractors.
Yeah. Right. So you had to buy all of your own equipment. And see what they would do. And they really, really got blacks and immigrants this way, but the white miners too, because blacks were imported from the South, and the immigrants, they would catch the immigrants right off Ellis Island. They would be there waiting for them. And they would say, do you want a job? Not only can we give you a job, we'll give you a house. And they would be like, wow, that's great. And they would get on a train and find themselves suddenly in Logan County, West Virginia, straight from Italy or Romania, Hungary, all these East European places. So they wouldn't have money for the first month's rent. So that money was fronted at the company store on credit. They wouldn't have money to buy their equipment. So that money was fronted to them on company credit. So your first day on the job, you're already eyeball deep in debt. And so you're always in debt. So you can't get ahead. And a lot of times on payday, you wouldn't even get any scrip because you would be so in debt to the company store. The old song, I owe my soul to the company store, that they used to sing in the coal fields, that you really did, because everything that you could buy was right there. It was like the Walmart of its day. And And a lot of times you didn't even get anything left over from your paycheck because you're so in debt. And so you can't get ahead. You can't accrue any savings. You can't accrue any wealth. The old myth that, if you work hard, you're going to get ahead. Well, you can do backbreaking work your whole life in a coal mine and never get out of debt. Mm-hmm. And of course, keeping them in debt keeps them there. They can't vote with their feet. In addition to that, the mine guards, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the mine guards. They were really, really brutal. These guys that they hired out were sometimes mercenaries, soldiers of fortune, ex-military, guys that had fought, like, say, in the French Foreign Legion in places like Africa with European imperialism, or like the Belgian Congo, or the Philippines. They liked getting American soldiers that had fought in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War. And they used those tactics in West Virginia. So it was people that weren't afraid to crack skulls, basically.
Were the people who were taking this up, were they from West Virginia themselves, or were they sort of being recruited from other parts of the country?
A few of them were from West Virginia, yes. Mm-hmm. But a lot of them weren't. It was a mix.
Yeah.
The Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was the primary agency, but you had sometimes sheriffs just employed deputies. And they served as mine guards. So they weren't necessarily Baldwin Felts, although most of them were. In Logan County, it was all deputies that worked for this guy by the name of Don Chafin that I've already mentioned. He had 300 deputies in Logan County. By the way, we have county police in Logan County where I teach, and there's 4 in the entire county, 4 policemen for the entire county today. There were 300 in 1921.
Talk about defund.
Yeah. Talk about defund the police. They did it in that regard. But they cracked skulls. They also served undercover. And at the Eastern Regional Coal Archives in Bluefield, where the headquarters of the Baldwin Felts Detective Agency was, I've seen the papers myself and used it for my research, that you have all these letters to the headquarters of, like, operative number 9, operative number 12, where they're undercover, sometimes posing as miners, as bartenders in the company saloon, because you had a company bar, you had a company church, and you had a company school as well, and a company preacher, a company bartender. So you're surrounded. So the bartender's listening. Is anybody talking socialism? Is anybody talking union? Is anybody complaining about conditions? And those people would be fired and blacklisted. In Mingo County, they actually built houses with blocks on top of blocks so that detectives could crawl underneath the houses at night and listen to conversations. During elections, they often filled out your ballot for you. So you went and the mine guards were there, and usually the mine foreman or a mine guard would fill out your ballot for you so that they would, could control the elections. And by the way, that had a long history in the coal fields, going really past the mine wars. And there are a lot of people that can remember when all the elections in the coal fields were fixed. And that's why when a guy like Donald Trump comes to West Virginia and says it's a rigged system, it resonates with a lot of people because they're like, yeah, it was rigged here. So they rigged elections. They went through your mail. All your mail was opened before you got it, because the mail, of course, went to the company store. So they opened your mail. So you didn't have any freedoms. I mean, you're living under this system, and you have 2 choices. You either keep your head down and try to endure it, or you fight back. And so the miners ultimately decided to fight back.
Yeah.
No, go ahead, Matt.
Oh, well, I didn't want to move too far on from that, but I was just struck by, the need for preservation on this. The parts in your book about historical identity and sort of placing yourself in this. You talk about the recent preservation stuff. The West Virginia National Guard wanted to put landing strips over it and anti-terrorism training. Like, just in terms of, like, it almost seems spiteful, like an attack on this sort of history. But talk a little bit about, like, the importance of finding your own Blair Mountain.
Okay, yeah. Well, I'm glad you mentioned the National Guard base, because nobody else asked me about this. Nobody I usually don't get a lot of questions about it. So where we were told, we got to destroy Blair Mountain for coal jobs. That's what coal miners were told. That's why when we did the protest march, people were screaming at us and spitting on us and throwing things and threatening us and all this other stuff. But we found it wasn't about coal jobs at all. They wanted to blast part of the battlefield to make runways for this drop zone and anti-terrorist group. And when we found anti-terrorist training, and we found out about it, I've got the letters saved on my computer that show what the plans were. And those plans originated right when Blair Mountain was put on the National Register. And they used that as leverage to get it taken off the National Register. We need this area for national defense. And they were going to make appeal to people's sense of patriotism in the region to try to justify destroying the battlefield. And now we stopped them. But it was dicey there for a while because we weren't just going against the coal industry. Then we found ourselves going against the military industrial complex, which is a whole nother level of scary. Yeah. If you find it, because, our members, not just me, but our other board members were, followed by black unmarked vehicles. We were, all of our mail got opened. We felt like we were in a company town. The way we were being monitored, and they made no attempts to hide the fact that they would follow us. Like they weren't
like it was a message.
Yeah, they weren't sneaky about it at all. Yeah. So it was pretty dicey there for a while. So they were using a lot of their different means, and that National Guard base, the National Guard was approached by the coal industry for this idea. And Don Blankenship, kind of the notorious coal operator in West Virginia, who was responsible for really destroying the Union in West Virginia, he was right in the center of the whole thing. So, and Joe Manchin went along with it. Who's now, of course, the senator. He was governor at the time. Now he has since come out and said, "I'm all for preserving Blair Mountain." In fact, I saw him last week at the Blair Centennial. He showed up at the last day. And what's funny, he gave a little talk at this Union rally and didn't mention Blair Mountain at all, but that's a whole nother story. But anyway, so I did talk about at the end, like finding your own Blair Mountain, something that you mentioned. It's kind of we were an activist group with just one goal in mind, right? We just wanted to save this battlefield. That was it. We want to save this battlefield. We want to get the history out there. And I think it's a good idea, in my opinion, for some nonprofit groups to, take that narrow regional approach. That I think that one of the ways in which you can possibly rebuild this country, if it's possible, in the face of climate change and the issues that we're going to be dealing with, it has to be done from the bottom up, I think, from the regional level. And I think that if people look outside their own doors and look around and try to you can't fix, some of the problems that we have as an individual, some of the social problems and the problems that we have in this country, but you can fix things right around you and you can make progress right around you. And I think what we were able to accomplish is a testimony to that. And we were able to bring groups together that have been at odds with one another. We brought the United Mine Workers and the Sierra Club, right, the number one environmental group in America, on the same page. And that was no small feat in my estimation. It was, they wouldn't even talk to each other, before we got involved in this. But Blair Mountain was that common ground. And we got to find that common ground to get those groups together. The left can be very fragmented at times. It can be very divided at times. And, it's not going to work if you're divided.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I find that to be just really important. And like, especially for us to be able to imagine something different in the future, being able to sort of, as Harvey K says, like take hold of our history too, like being able to root yourself, because I don't know, like, I grew up in the South, and like you have this kind of image of like where you are and all this kind of thing. And if you become a leftist, right, you sort of feel like you're betraying, or like you're leaving your family or your community behind. And I'm, one of the big messages of this show is to tell people, it's like, no, there's a deep rooted history of, resistance and justice too all across the country. And it's important to be able to uphold that.
Yeah, and I'll say even something. I'll even add to that, David, is that in West Virginia 100 years ago, there's a wonderful book on the Socialist Party in West Virginia called Working Class Radicals by one of my academic mentors, Fred Barkey. And he did this amazing research because there was a brief period where the Socialist Party was pretty strong in West Virginia. And there were largely two groups that the socialists appealed to: coal miners and Christians. Okay. Protestant evangelical Christians. I mentioned the company churches in Logan County and Mingo County. So coal miners would go off the company property to go to church, because a lot of them went to church. I mean, it's still a very, churchy place, right? So people would go off company property and go to these little country churches, and the preachers were socialists and the churches were socialists. And, if you go into a church today in, Central Appalachia and say all the Christians 100 years ago were socialists, it just makes their heads want to explode, because, they're like, what? They've been brainwashed into some kind of Fox News version of Christianity that is unlike what 100 years ago, when they saw socialist values of sharing wealth. They're like, well, that's just right up Jesus's alley. That's exactly what we should be doing, because the love of money is the root of all evil. And so that was really appealing to Christians 100 years ago. And people don't know about that tradition. And I would imagine that you might find that in other places in the South. And that really turns the narrative on its head when you find out that your roots, your heritage, is very different than what you thought it would be. On one hand, it can be disturbing, but it can also be very liberating.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it just goes to show too, like on a larger historical scale, like how it's important to fight these kind of battles too. Is like what defines us as a people, right? And culture, because the right has done that pretty effectively now that we've lost a lot of that memory. I just wanted to make sure that we didn't neglect to ask the red bandana, right? Is it true that that there is that there might be a connection between the term redneck and the Battle of Blair Mountain?
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about briefly about the history of the red bandana. The earliest documented case I've found of the use of the red bandana goes to the 1877 railroad strike that began in Martinsburg, West Virginia, the first national strike. And there were some of the workers started wearing red bandanas. Coal miners very quickly thereafter also took to wearing red bandanas. And of course, they were referred to as rednecks. Now, I don't know if that's the actual origin of the term, because in the 1890s, you also have it being applied to Southern farmers. And I'm sure you've heard that one, the rednecks from the sunburn. Yeah. Right. So you have that in use by the 1890s. So I'm not going to go as far as to say that's where the term originated, but I will say that in the coal fields, if you said the word redneck 100 years ago, it didn't mean anything like what it means today. It meant you were a union man. It meant that it was a symbol of solidarity. And why that's significant, if you recall me saying that the miners didn't control the narrative. The main narrative, other than the miners were kind of manipulated by communists and outsiders, a big part of the narrative was these hillbillies that were taking up arms are only doing so because they're a part of a backward, isolated, uncivilized culture. So because they control the narrative, the term redneck morphs into this backward, uncivilized, get her done, rebel flag kind of guy that becomes the stereotype. And, if you tell people they are a certain way long enough, they start to believe it. And, one of the things that really upsets me about my home that I love is that some people have, embraced the stereotype as opposed to embracing the actual identity, what it really meant regionally. But we've revived the red bandana. And coal miners used the red bandana a bit in the 60s. But then once you get into more recent times, environmental groups in the region have used the red bandana. Teachers used the red bandana during the 2018 strike. And we of course, used it as a symbol with our protest march to save the battlefield. And it's kind of reinserted itself. And I'm glad to see that it coming back as a symbol.
That's exactly sort of what happened with the term Luddite, actually. Like, it was originally like a more sort of focused labor resistance movement that got portrayed as sort of a cartoonishly, or eventually like understood as a cartoonishly like stupid group of people, which is very silly.
Right.
When David and I come to Southern West Virginia, just you've already mentioned, I think, the museum, but what are the sort of memorials we can go and look at when we? I'm excited to go down there. Actually, I was flying over it in a Microsoft Flight Simulator. I'll look at the mountains.
Did you see all the mountaintop removal sites?
You can see all it on there.
Wow.
Yeah, it's breathtaking to see if you fly over Southern West Virginia, all the mountaintop removal sites, the devastation that's there. It's really hard to get appreciate the scale of destruction until you see it from the air.
Right.
Because some of these mountaintop removal sites are massive sites. I saw one statistic that said that you could fit 8 Disney Worlds onto all the mountaintop removal site acreage in central Appalachia, which is just astonishing. The amount and somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,000 miles of streams have been wiped out. And we're wiping out our water supplies at a time when water is going to be the oil of the 21st century, with climate change. Yeah. So where would you go in West Virginia? If you're in the coal fields, of course, Mate One is, ground zero for the history, not just the museum itself, but the town itself. The town is really rich in history, and that's the town itself sits on the property that used to belong to Devilance Hatfield of the Hatfield-Mccoy feud. So a lot of the Hatfield-Mccoy feud incidents took place right there as well. So a lot of real interesting things happened there in Mate One. But you can go along Paint Creek and Cabin Creek. There's 2 historic markers that refer to the mine works. Only 2. They're just little markers on the side of the road that you'll miss if you don't know where they are. There's one in the town of, it's not really a town, in the settlement of Blair. It's not really a town anymore. And one at Holly Grove, where the Holly Grove tent colony was along Paint Creek. But so there aren't a lot of markers. I mean, you can go up and drive over Blair Mountain, over the southern crest of Blair Mountain. So you can go out there and see it, but there aren't really any markers there to, things to, there's gates.
Yeah.
Where the coal company, and I can go up there, but I can't stay for long because they know me. And so I have to get up there and get out before security comes after me. So it's kind of tragic that there are a lot of places that are blocked off. We found, we went up and did a little mini excavation with metal detectors at a machine gun bunker that was built on Cabin Creek by mine guards a few weeks ago. That's still up there. But again, it's up there in the middle of the woods. You have to know where to find some of those markers. But Mate One is ground zero. If you're in the DC area and about an hour outside of DC on the eastern panhandle of the state in Charlestown, you can go to the courthouse where the miners were tried. And that's the same courthouse that John Brown was tried in. So John Brown's treason trial and the miners' treason trial took place in the same spot, same building.
Wow. Well, Charles, the book is The Road to Blair Mountain, Saving a Mine Wars Battlefield from King Coal. Thank you so much. I can't recommend the book enough for people who are, taking their time to listen to a history conversation, and from a podcast like this. It's definitely who want guidance in terms of like how to channel your interest in history into something that's useful for your community. I think it's a prime example of that. So thank you so much for your work.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And we'll see you guys next week.